I always say if we're doing these webinars, masterclass in the middle of the day, usually a bunch of sales folks jumping off their last call, sending their follow-up notes right after like they should. So we'll give everyone a minute or two to come in. Maybe as folks are joining, we can do a bit of an icebreaker. Maybe do the classic. We got an interesting one from Nick today, maybe where we're all calling in from. And let's change it up a little bit. What are we going to do? Maybe we'll do favorite sales tactic picked up from someone you've worked with. Because we're doing, kind of shouting out someone that's helped you pick up something. I have something top of mind. So yeah, maybe you can shout out a fellow seller who's taught you something. In the old days when we were on the sales floor all together, I can start out. So I'm Ross Rich, CEO and co-founder of Accord, calling in from sunny Toronto, Canada today. And I'll never forget this one, which is from Daniel Stallsmith when I was at Stripe. I was working on the biggest negotiation of my career at the time. And he gave me the great advice. I wanted to come in. I think we needed to figure out maybe this little discount on the deal. He said, do not send that over. Get on the call. Don't talk about the discount until you figure out exactly what needs to happen to say yes. And then say, if we're able to do all of this, can we do it at this price? And I'll never forget that. And it's unlocked a lot of deals and helped me also prevent even having to go in with a discount to a lot of deals that still needed a lot of work to be done before talking pricing. So that's one that comes to mind. But Nick, how about yourself?
That's a good one, Ross. And I didn't know you were in Toronto. It's actually funny. I grew up on the other side of Lake Ontario. I grew up in Rochester, New York, which is a much, much smaller city than Toronto. But we used to look across Lake Ontario and my parents would say, oh, that's Canada. I think one of the favorite sales tips, tactics, strategies that I learned from my CRO a couple jobs ago. And he was obsessed. I mean, this guy was obsessed, adamant about the power of this magic device right here, which is called a phone. And I was one of those sellers who, like, I'd get an email from the customer and they'd say, hey, I really liked the demo that you showed the other day. Here's like 3 different questions that I have. By the way, I'm wondering about implementation and we need to probably get a discount on the implementation cost. And so they would like dump this big email on me and I would get it in my inbox. And one, I'd be happy because they'd be engaged, but I would spend so much time writing out this perfectly formatted email with hyperlinks and attachments of like, let me answer all of your questions. And one of the things that I learned, and this has been ingrained into my head, is that when I get an email like that, instead I should just pick up the phone and call that person. And I should say something along the lines of, hey, I just got your email. It looks like there's a lot of questions swirling around out there. I wanted to get a sense of like what's top of mind for you. And what you end up getting is the customer says, well, 3 of those things weren't even really that important, but like, here's the big 2 that I want to talk about. And when you have a synchronous conversation like that, you're able to accomplish so much more. What ends up happening is you communicate way, way more than you would in that email, and you make your own life easier. You save a ton of time. So it's the power of the phone. Whenever I can, I opt for a synchronous phone call conversation with my customer over me sending a 42-page email, which I was oft to do before.
Totally love that. And very similar vibe, which is like, don't ever sell over email.
Email is really good for confirming meetings and like sharing collateral or sharing content. But it's not really good for having a real dialogue with the customer. And if you actually think about like what goes into selling, like building trust and having a back and forth conversation and coming to shared conclusions, you don't really do that via a text only email. Oh, I'm seeing some good stuff in the chat here. Evergreen, Colorado. I think this is from Charles. Sell to the business pain, not technical pain. Evergreen sounds like a pretty place too. Totally. Then we got Sam. Scarcity breeds creativity. Understanding and diffusing objections, not handling or rebuttals. Sell the before and after story. That's a good one too. I like the scarcity breeds creativity one. I think that's really true.
And yes, understand and diffuse. You don't speak back to it. Like, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but this thing is true. You're like, that's, not a great way to approach it. Love that. Awesome. Well, maybe we can start now that a few folks are coming in, can start actually introducing what we're going to be talking about today. And this is one of my favorite topics, and I know a topic that Nick is also super passionate about. It's really what sales is. How to win more deals by helping your buyers do what? Helping them buy. And yes, it sounds kind of funny, but I think when we reflect on a lot of what happens in B2B sales today, it's not necessarily helping them buy, it's selling. And I think the best way to improve deal velocity and win rates is by doing what we're going to talk about today. So hopefully folks on this now or watching the recording can share with the rest of their team on great ways to accelerate deal velocity, win rates, helping them get to success by helping them buy. Yeah, before we dive in, what does this mean to you, Nick?
What does helping the customer buy mean to me? I think that there are so many distractions available to you as a salesperson as to what you should be focused on and where you should spend your time. And I think it's important to look at all of the work that you do as a salesperson through the lens of helping the other person accomplish what they are setting out to accomplish, solving the problems that they have or reaching the goals that they've set out for themselves. And when you look at everything that you have to do, sending a follow-up proposal, sharing information with the customer, multi-threading the deal, it's not through the intent of like, I got to get this deal done. It's through the lens of like, all right, how do I help them accomplish what they want to accomplish? And the side effect of that is you end up selling a lot more deals and you end up closing them much, much quicker. And so I don't think what we're going to talk about today is this like, oh yeah, like don't sell, don't get your deal closed, just be there to help them, because the fact of the matter is salespeople, like you have a quota and your job is to close business. But when you actually look at it from the perspective of like, all right, how do I best help this person accomplish what they have set out to accomplish? And part of that is even understanding what do they want to accomplish? Things end up getting a lot easier for you and selling becomes quite fun.
100%. And sometimes helping them buy is not a decision to either go with your product, or at least maybe right now, if you deeply understand how they should ideally be buying, not just from you, but in general, helping them solve a business problem. Yes, it's a lot more fun, both for the seller as well as, for the buyer. So let's dig in. What does it lead to? So we've talked a little bit about like why it's important. What is it? What does it lead to? Like okay, so now you're thinking about, okay, maybe I'm going to change the way that I'm doing this. What are some of those outcomes, Nick, that you track towards?
Well, I want to also orient also around like what doing the work for the buyer and helping them
buy
that's actually
a good place
like
to start.
Feels and looks like, and the easiest part of buying something is opening up the e-signature tool and clicking sign. And then writing a check isn't that hard either. You take out a pen and you scribble on the pen, or you click a couple buttons to ACH the money, or you swipe your credit card. That's not the hard part of buying something. The hard part of buying something is getting consensus from your colleagues. Like Ross, I'm sure when you buy things as the CEO of Accord, like you're not just sitting there swiping the credit card. You're talking with your team. You're coordinating with your team. You're saying, hey, this is why this thing tracks to one of the big KPIs or North Stars that we set out for at the beginning of the year. You're having to build a business case for your colleagues. You have to do stuff like compare comparable products. Like there's so many softwares out there where it's like, yes, you as a seller understand the nuances between them. But if I'm Ross and I've got 42 meetings on my calendar this week, I don't have a ton of brain space to figure out how is software A different than software B. And so when I think about the importance of this and why you do this is you're doing the hardest part of buying for your customer. If you take care of all of the hard parts, helping them communicate with their colleagues about, hey, Ross, met with your head of operations earlier this week. This were the 3 things that we talked about. Let me give you a recap. Okay, now it's really easy for Ross to be like, okay, cool, I get it. I get the value here. I just get to do the easy part now, which is sign the check. And that's what I want. I want to have Ross just do the easy part. When I leave it up to Ross, because frankly, as the salesperson, I'm probably more incentivized and more motivated to get the deal done. Like it's my job. It's not Ross's job. Ross has 1.5 million other jobs. And so if I can make it really, really easy for Ross to do just one thing, which is say, cool, let me sign the contract and let's send the check. Deals get closed faster. bigger deals get closed. You end up having more fun as a seller because you have a lot more visibility and momentum around your deals, because now I'm not sitting and waiting for Ross to go talk to his head of operations to have their one-on-one sync next Tuesday so he can get caught up on where the deal is. I'm saying to Ross, hey, here's the 3-bullet email of what we talked about, so you're up to speed. Now, when he meets with his head of operations, he's like, I got the summary. Like, is there anything else we need to talk about? No? Cool. Let's move on. So what ends up happening is you close deals faster. So I think what I'd like to talk about, let's talk about some like strategies for us to actually do that, because it's easy for me to sit here sipping my nice European-sized water and say, oh, do the work for your customer, help them. It's another story to actually talk about some of the specifics in terms of what we can do.
Love that. Okay. So in my mind, let's start. We'll go from maybe earlier in the deal cycle, and we'll talk about some specific tactics and suggestions and our favorite things to do as you progress. Maybe we'll pick plus or minus mid-market deal, because you add in a few steps for the enterprise and you take away a few for the SMB high velocity. Let's pick your standard 30, 50-ish K deal. One of my favorite things to do early on the deal to do my work for my buyer, 2 things I think about. First is, say they reach out. This is an inbound, make it easy. Inbound deal. I think even if you have a pretty low no-show rate, you can always have better early conversations from sending a great note before the first meeting. Help them orient themselves to the potential outcomes that you usually see. Don't ask them to do homework, but say something like, imagine you're a buyer, the head of sales, VP sales, Series A or B company. Hey, Nick, saw you set a meeting for tomorrow from our website, excited to chat. Based on where you are, let's say I did 2 minutes of research and saw you have 5 reps on your team. Hey, looks like you're building out the initial sales team at 30MPC. Excited to dig into ways you might be able to build out your repeatable playbook, drive deal velocity, and make customers happy post-sales. Anything in particular hoping to chat about. Even if you don't reply, boom, we're going to be talking about this thing. You're already oriented to it. Little tiny touches like that can totally change the likelihood to convert into an opportunity and have a better conversation about something specific versus you're doing a million things. You're going to your one-on-ones. You're helping close deals for your team because you're an early sales leader, all these things. Okay, shit, what is a quote? I clicked on this link yesterday, a demo. I don't even remember what I'm doing. They're going to pull up that email and see that. Curious to get your take on how you approach those early meetings, Nick.
Well, I think what you can do is, you mentioned doing research before that meeting. And I think all salespeople know, okay, before the meeting, I probably need to take some prep notes and have the prep notes organized. Have you ever considered sending those notes to the customer and saying, not just like, hey, it looks like you're growing out your sales team. You say the specifics of like, hey, I was preparing for this meeting. Yeah. Like literally here. And okay, you might have to put in a couple extra minutes to make sure the notes are like clean to be customer facing, because I usually take my notes pretty shorthand, but you put the notes in the meeting and say, here's what I found out about you. It looks like you hired 3 new salespeople last year. You guys are doing monthly masterclass webinars. It looks like you're doing X and Y and Z. And then, like most salespeople often do going into a sales call, you have a hypothesis of how your thing can potentially help based on what you learned. You say, you're like in your mind, every salesperson does this. You do your research and you think about, okay, how can my thing help? Well, put that in the prep email to the customer. And even if you don't get a reply, like you said, what you are doing is, I have a belief that you can't be perceived to be better until you're first perceived to be different. And if you actually send your prep notes to the customer, like 98% of salespeople won't do, you're already setting yourself apart. And you give them an opportunity to say, hey, wait, actually, your hypothesis is a little bit wrong, but here's what I'm actually thinking. And now you're starting the conversation on a much higher plane. So if you want like an easy cheat, it's just like you're taking the notes already, copy, paste them in the email.
Yeah, I think this like idea of doing things radically, collaboratively, transparently in sales, it totally changed the way that I approached deals, and all the things that I used to keep internally and all this stuff just started sharing, and it completely transformed the conversations I was having. And suddenly I was brought in, we talk a lot about this, but like as a business partner, as a consultant on these things, because I'm thinking about them clearly. It's not, hey, looks like you work at this company, super interesting. It's like, you didn't look at the company. You're just sending it. It's worse than even not sending the note. And I think that's what a lot of people are programmed to do. And I don't know what it is. I think people want to do this. I think they're afraid maybe of saying the wrong thing or having the wrong note in there. But like you said, even if you're wrong about your hypothesis, you show them that you did the research, you show them that you care, and that they're spending 30 minutes talking to this random company. They're going to talk to someone else who cares and put in some time on the other side and had a hypothesis. They'd be like, oh no, I can see how you got there. If you're just a reasonable minded person, you're like, I can see how you would think this way. No, we're actually doing this. And that's better than that.
There's a saying, Ross, you made me think of right there. It's people respond in kind. And what that means is the level of effort that you put into the sale, like you'll get that in response. And so I think one thing for salespeople to consider is there's a lot of work that you do when you're working your deals behind the scenes, right? You're coordinating with your product team to get answers around like complex product questions the customer might have had. You're doing a lot of work, like putting a proposal together. You're like doing research into their company, especially in like a deeper enterprise sale. You're monitoring stuff that they're doing and you're taking notes of that somewhere. And if you think about like, I think a lot of tech companies use Slack, and I see a ton of my colleagues in Slack, like sharing, here's a really interesting article about the industry, or, oh, I saw this about one of our prospects, like, good to know. Instead of sending that to your team, like, why don't you send that to your customer? The thing is, I really don't, what I don't want to do is sit here and say, hey, everyone on this masterclass, here's more work to dump onto your plate. The way that I think about it is like, what's the stuff that you're already probably doing? You're probably giving an update to your boss on like where the deal sits. Okay, well, let's take those bullet points that you gave to her and send those to the customer too. And again, you might need to change the language a little bit, but you're already like, you have all of this communication going on your side. If you can open it up and like, you use the word transparent, Ross, but like, you're literally being like, hey, like, here's my understanding of things. I guess one thing to talk about, we're talking about that discovery call, and we talked about stuff that I'm doing pre-discovery call, and we can maybe talk about during discovery call, but I want to jump to like the very end of it. Throughout the sales process, you are going to pull things out from the customer that are important to them, like goals that they have. They might say, hey, we want to hit a certain number of SQLs in our engagement with you. And if you hear that, and you hear that that's something that's important to them, your job is to document that. And so like one of the things that I really like doing when I'm in the process of a deal is sending like, hey, by the way, here's the things that I heard that are important to you. And I'll put them in bullets and I will put them in the words that I heard the customer use.
Yeah.
And I don't always get it right. I'll often get, yeah, those things are right, Nick, but here's the fourth bullet point to add.
Yeah.
Well, gosh, to go back to the people responding kind, I'm showing that like, I'm doing my best here. I'm listening. I'm taking notes. This is what you said was important. Did I get it right? And if you show that like you're willing to put in the work and do that, even if you don't get the deal, like they're like, okay, this person actually cares. Will, thank you for participating. I like your phraseology there. View your client as a colleague. That was much more succinct than me who rambled about it for 10 and a half minutes.
That's a good perspective. And let's hit on, because I feel like I've chatted with a lot of sellers about this idea of treating them as peers. And I see that there's this barrier. I can feel it when I'm on calls with reps where I think it's afraid to do some of this stuff. I think the vast majority of B2B sellers want to be the best. Typically competitive, you're putting yourselves in it's a tough job. Whether you're from an SDR to an SMB seller to an enterprise seller, it's a hard job. You're getting said no to a lot, all this stuff. They want to be better. What is preventing people from doing this stuff? What do you think that mental barriers, and how do you help, maybe if you're a sales leader, get people over that hump of sharing those internal notes, of instead of just saying, here's our 3 case studies and here's our next steps, it's vulnerable in a way because you're kind of sharing your perspective with someone who's more senior. So I'm curious to get your take on how do you overcome that?
Well, and Michael had a good point that can also help neutralize the power differential, because you're right. Like, I come on a call with Ross and like, he's the CEO and I'm sure not a CEO. And so it already, you feel like, oh man, like I'm not where that person is. And I think the big thing to keep in mind, you use the word vulnerability. And I really like that you used that word, because a mantra or mantra, depending on how you want to pronounce it these days, that I live by is that success in sales is defined by the number of uncomfortable conversations or uncomfortable situations that you're willing to put yourself in or that you're willing to have. So the more you can seek out discomfort as a seller, oftentimes the more successful you're going to be. And if you think about what being uncomfortable looks like as a salesperson, it materializes or manifests in a couple ways. It might be like multi-threading and calling the CEO who like, yeah, he was on that first meeting, but you've been talking to someone maybe like one step below that person and like you need to re-engage them. It can be scary to call the CEO, especially when you're not the CEO. It can be scary to pick up the phone and call Ross. It could be things like what you talked about, being vulnerable and saying like, here's what I heard. Like I might have gotten this wrong.
Yeah.
And I think there are so many like tips and tricks and hacks out there to get your buyer to open up and be transparent with you and tell you what's really going on in their buying process and how they feel about the competitor. And let's reorient around responding in kind. Yeah. Well, if I'm vulnerable and transparent,
if you're not doing that, good luck. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really helpful. Yeah.
It literally happens in the scenario that I just described where I send the 3 bullet points and I'm vulnerable because they might say, no, actually number 2 is wrong. You got it wrong. Here's what it really is.
Yeah.
I mean, gosh, what a better way to check for understanding.
Yeah, no, this is talking this through, I think is a helpful reframing of it's not, I think what my initial take on this was like, hey, as a seller, I went in and I wanted to do all this extra work because I wanted to get as much as possible from every single lead and every single opportunity, 1% better at every single touch. And I'm going to be 200% every quarter. But what is preventing? And I thought that people didn't want that. I thought it was, they didn't want to work. Everyone wants to get there. But what is preventing that? I think it was, I'm fine with people. I don't know. It's just like, I was just fine with people being like, Ross, no, or like embarrassing myself until I figured out the way to do it. And I think that might be what some of that barrier is. How do you help your team get uncomfortable and put themselves out there? It's a helpful way of thinking about it, I think.
We have a question from Jeremy. He says, what's the best way of managing a build or buy decision with an enterprise prospect? Jeremy, what do you mean when you say build or buy? I've heard it mean different things to different people. Jeremy is furiously typing on his keyboard right now, I hope. And I can't see Jeremy. So if Jeremy's not and like went to get a cup of water or something, we're going to sit here and wait. Jeremy, while you type that, Ross, I want to revisit the question that you asked about like sort of that power dynamic and differential and sort of what's causing it and how to get over it. And I think like the more you expose yourself to those uncomfortable decisions or situations of like, hey, this is my understanding of things, I think you build that muscle out a little bit. I think the other thing, like you mentioned, here's instead of sending your bullet points, you're sending, here's our 3 case studies. And I think part of it is there's a perception that folks who are like above the power line, folks like you, right? The CEO, they're all buttoned up and super professional. And like, they would be insulted if you didn't send something that was like beautiful, like what your marketing team put together. And the reality is, let's use the case study example. Ross, if I sent you 3 case studies, you're not even going to open them.
No, because I know what they are. They're not your experience working with customers every single day. It is it's the super, super buttoned up thing. Honestly, even with G2 in a way, it's like, these are the things that we've decided are going to be out there in the world.
Well, and so the way that I think, let's go back to the topic, which is like doing the work for the customer. Ideally, when I send those case studies, it's because I thought, well, these are sort of similar customers, or Ross made a point on our discovery call that's addressed in this case study here. And I think your job as the seller is, if you're going to send over a case study that's like, it requires me to open it up, give me the bullets of like, hey, this is why I thought this was valuable for you. Yeah. So yes, look, send that stuff over because yes, not everyone is going to read it, but also say, and here is the reason that I am sharing this with you. On page 2 in paragraph 3, you can see that there's a quote, and I even summarized the quote here. Well, now Ross knows, okay, if I want to go dig deeper, I can. But again, do the summary, do the summarization for the customer. If you send over a 3-page case study, summarize it in a single paragraph. Like one thing I've even done is like, again, I'm picking on you, Ross, because I see you and I know you, but like, if you're the CEO and you're on a demo of my thing and I've shown like, you leave halfway through, right? I'm not just going to send you the recording of the demo. I'm going to like chop that thing up. And I like sending a highlight reel where it's like, hey, here's the 42-second highlight reel. Here's the one moment where your head of operations gasped because she said, wow, that is really cool. And that's going to save me a lot of time. Like, I'm going to share that stuff. I realize I've been talking so much.
And Jeremy jumped in here. Customers in early phases of building a similar product. This is, maybe I can speak to this because it's honestly very similar to what I've seen both at Accord and at Stripe, which is, hey, people are trying to solve this problem, not by, hey, we have an existing SaaS or whatever solution, and we're looking at staying on it or moving to a new one. This is, hey, we've actually hacked together something, or we're in the midst of hacking together something internally. It's a very different decision. It's not, hey, we're going to move to something. It's, we might not even. And most deals are lost because of a no decision. So this is exponentially harder than that, hey, we're looking to buy something or we're already paying for something and we can switch. Those are much easier deals than the build or buy, because there's a low risk decision, which is your team just keeps on taking it on. You don't have to be the person that puts your neck out there and uses your social capital to buy something when that doesn't need to happen. And the best way of managing, I would say, is a very strong business case that reflects the trade-offs and not just speaks to your features. Hey, we do checklisting this way and they do it this way, or this is what we see, most people's solutions look like internally versus externally. It needs to be the quantified outcomes of doing it internally relatively well, not just like shitting on like, this is how people do it terribly. Like, hey, if you do it well internally, this is what it's going to cost to build and maintain yourself. And this is usually the level that you'll get to, because I've seen a bunch of people do this. Yes, exactly. That's what a lot of people, I think the default is it's going to be shit. And if you're starting there, they're not going to care about what you say next, because you have what a lot of people say is like commission breath, like you're trying to sell your thing. No, this is 10 out of 10, the investment that it takes to build, maintain, and do this thing. This is what ours looks like. And again, not feature to feature, but the cost to build and maintain and the outcomes, and your cost to purchase without the building and maintaining, and the incremental, believable difference. So I'll give you an example for Accord, since people are tuning in and probably have a relative decent understanding about what we do. This is that Google Sheet, that Google Doc, that maybe Notion, Airtable, whatever the thing is you're doing to build your work backwards plan, and buying something. Hey, let's say X percentage of your team is using this today. You guys build the best thing ever. You get the best, in world's class type thing usage. Half your team are using these things. And it helps. It's going to help because it's not worse than not doing it. It's going to help drive deals by this amount, deal velocity, win rates, etc. With Accord, you're going to get at least 80% adoption. And if this is the average number of deals that reps are using, and this is your average ACV, and you think it's going to help drive deal velocity by only 10% more, this is it. And they can see black and white the decision they need to make. And that's, I think, the best way of doing this is not calling their baby ugly, being honest about what their solution could look like, conservative on all the costs, and getting on a call and walking someone through it. And 90% of the time, this is what's going to happen. F you, I don't believe that number. F you, I don't believe that number. Okay, this looks reasonable. Okay, half of that. And then you say, cool. Well, you just said you believe this number and half of this. This is the ROI, and usually tells a story where it makes sense to partner. That's how I've approached it and found it incredibly effective. Nick, what has been your experience with these kinds of decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step, if the customer is telling you that they are considering a build versus buy scenario, sometimes that is the customer nicely saying to you, hey, we're going to be building this thing. This isn't a deal. And so I think you need to get their permission. Like Ross, what you just talked through is an extremely comprehensive overview of the factors for consideration versus going down one path, build, or another, buy. Prior to me doing any of that, I need to understand from the customer, like, hey, I talk to a lot of customers who are making that consideration about going down the road of build and going down the road of buy. And if you think it would be helpful, I can share some of the pros and cons of each scenario, because there are certainly pros and cons to each. I'm not going to sit here as the salesperson and pretend that my thing is the perfect.
It always makes sense. Yeah. The answer exactly is, hey, for some companies, it makes sense.
Yes. And so what you do is, I think you present to them like, hey, look, there are pros and cons to each, because, and I'm aware of them because I have these conversations a lot, because truthfully, a lot of folks are in your shoes considering build versus buy. What I'm doing there is I'm saying, hey, look, you're not alone, Mr. Customer. You're not the only person out there who's thought about this. I'm also sort of priming them that I'm going to share an objective viewpoint. And I think it's important that when you do go through like that ROI or that deck or whatever you're doing to like compare and contrast the two, that you're not just painting like sunshine, rainbows, and butterflies for your thing. I think you have to give a relatively objective view. Now, you're not going to sit here and talk about how they shouldn't go down the road of your thing, but you should let them know some of the pros of taking the other approach. And then the way that I think about it is like, when you're communicating that information, there's probably 800 pros and 800 cons of each approach. And your job is not to give the customer like Webster's dictionary, like every single combination and permutation of pros and cons of each. Your key is to share some of the highlights. And if I'm you, when you share the highlights of why they should go with buy, the highlights are the things that were most important to them. And when you share the lowlights of going with the other solution, well, you should share the things that like they were like, hey, we really want to make sure we don't take up the team's bandwidth, or it's really important to us that we're able to customize the skin on how it looks, so it looks like, it's our system. You might want to like consider highlighting where you're strong and where the other solution is weak based on what you learned from them.
And vice versa. I always found that the most impactful actually is like, hey, this is where it makes more sense to build internally versus buy.
Yes.
And if you can tell that story objectively, where like the right person would be sitting there, there'd be two people sitting there, and one would actually be like, oh, that makes sense for me. And the other person would be like, that makes sense to me. I think that's the best way to approach it. That's kind of what I was going through. Like, hey, if you have extra engineering resources, like how often is the case, but like, fine, if you have that and it's a simple thing, cool, it makes sense to do this. And if you're talking to that person, boom, it makes sense. So well, great question. I want to get back on some of these tips around helping buyers buy, but that's, a great way to approach helping them make that decision that we just chatted through. Sorry, Nick, were you going to jump in with something?
I was going to say, Jeremy, if you have more like questions or stuff you want us to cover around that, just let us know in the chat. I want to make sure we're addressing the stuff that's important to you. But totally. You were going to say something, Ross.
Yeah, I was going to talk about kind of stepping back and then digging into, I think, one of the most helpful ways that I found doing the work for my buyer and helping them buy. The idea behind this is, you as a seller, you get paid likely commission, and your sole job is getting to signature, ideally getting them to success on your product. I think I got it philosophically. I didn't really get it until I'm in the role that I'm in now as a buyer of software, that yes, you have a job on top of potentially evaluating, validating, and onboarding to a solution from a seller. And I think thinking about it in the way of, hey, how can I help this person just focus on their core job and do every little frickin' thing that they might have to do, like updating their team, like thinking about it as much as I am and putting it in their head and over communicating. And this is something that I thought I was doing, but there's no way I was doing nearly enough now that I'm in the role that I'm in, and seeing how my team brings this up in our quarterly planning reviews, in our annual planning, in our weekly OKR reviews. If you're talking about those things and helping communicate that to the organization that is evaluating it, you're going to sell a much higher percentage, win a much higher percentage of deals at a higher ACV for sure. So let's talk about how you can help do that. My favorite way doing this, built a company around it, mutual action plans, mapping out their frickin' job, not just your sales process, but the entire journey for the customer to evaluate, validate, and onboard, picking the next couple things on the list and helping them do that thing. How have you done this, Nick, in previous roles?
Well, I want to really highlight what you just said, Ross. You said it a couple times here. What we are not talking about is a close plan. When I was a new seller, I stumbled across the idea of a close plan, which is similar to a mutual action plan in that you're putting together all of the steps to get a deal closed and get a deal won. And then I continued to stumble, and I fell flat on my face because I stumbled so hard, because a close plan doesn't really help the buyer get to the place that they want to get. It doesn't get them to the place of problem is solved or goal is achieved. A mutual action plan does, because what it includes is not just, hey, the contract was signed. It includes, here's what happens after the contract is signed to get you to the place that you want to get. And so when you do that, it's a much more friendly experience for the buyer, because now they're saying, oh, this is actually designed to help me. And this gives me visibility into how I am going to get where I need to get. I think like one area that I think a lot of sellers can improve on is more deeply understanding what actually happens after the contract is signed. Because when I was selling software, that was the biggest concern that my customers had, was like, all right, well, like once we sign this thing, what's it actually look like? What's implementation look like? I was selling a law firm ERP system for a long, long time. And those are big, hairy, challenging projects that take sometimes more than a year and a half. And if I was able to articulate, hey, here's what it actually looks like when you sign the contract, the customer, you could feel. And so I think some of the keys here, you're talking about not just to close, it's not just a close plan, it's through getting you live, getting you implemented, keeping you happy, helping you achieve what you want to achieve. So talk about stuff like the QBRs that your customer success team does. Talk about stuff like, hey, like this is what support hours look like. This is what our support system looks like. It seems menial, and you need to make sure that stuff's important to the customer. But and so a question you might ask while you're sort of in the mutual action plan building discussion stage with the customer is like, hey, like, to what extent would you like me to communicate what things look like post-contract? And I'm using that question really strategically, because what I don't ever want to do is what I'm doing here, which is just free-form talking and talking about whatever the heck Nick wants to talk about. I want to like home in on the things that are most
what is important. Yeah.
Right. And so when I ask that question, I love that question. I use, to what extent is it important for me to talk about the things that happen post-contract signature? The customer will say, well, I don't really care about like what the QBR process looks like. Like, we're not worried about that, but it's really important to us that you guys have really good support hours, because we ran into an issue where the CEO couldn't log on to like, okay, now I know I'm going to zoom in on that. And so I think sort of sense checking them there. I could keep talking. I could ramble here for 42 minutes, but we don't have that much time. So I'll let you ask another question, Ross. We're at a point.
Yeah, no. So I think, my kind of two key takeaways there. One, mutual, that, hey, this isn't our plan to get the contract across the line or even to success. This is what I need to do, what you need to do. And then I'm basically doing what you need to do, because I know if I leave you with homework from an IC level to a director to VP to CEO, the likelihood of you doing something, because you have a job on top of it, it's not about product market fit and how much of a need to have and vitamin versus painkiller. It's like, people are just not going to do the thing because they don't get paid for you to do it, which I do. Why wouldn't I just take on 95% of that task?
And it'll get done better. It'll get done better when you do it. Now, there are times that, Ross, I've got to assign you homework because you're the customer and like you're the only one who's going to be able to do this thing.
Yeah.
Again, I do the work for the customer by staying on top of that thing.
Yes.
And so like the biggest thing that I've been doing recently in my recap emails, right? The email that I send after the meeting with the customer is like, I'm keeping them really simple. And I'm actually assigning action items. Now you can do that in a tool like Accord. You can assign action items. I think it's important to like stay on top of that person and document what the action item actually is. I think that's the biggest one, is the documentation of like, Ross and I were on a call and Ross said that he was going to go talk with his head of operations around the reports that they needed to look at on a monthly basis from my tool. Okay, cool. I'm not just going to have Ross like go put that on his to-do list. It's my job to send that follow-up email and say, hey, like, we met, or put it in a map and say, hey, here are the 3 things that you said you were going to take care of by X date. Now, if those things don't happen, this gives me extra leverage as a seller, because the next time that we communicate, I can point back to those things, and it gives me a chance to sort of sense check the deal.
Yeah.
What I'm not doing is saying, oh, the deal's off, Ross didn't do his homework, but like, I can say, hey, like, I think last time we spoke, and I put in the, like, you're pointing in the follow me, like, hey, last we spoke, you were going to do X and Y by this date. Like, to what extent were you able to have those conversations with your colleague, knowing that the answer might be no? Okay, now I can sort of drill in, like, is this as important as Ross originally said it was? Because again, I don't want to work a deal where someone is not really engaged in doing their stuff. So the documentation of like, hey, you asked for this piece of collateral, it was shared here in our master mutual action plan. Or you asked this question, I put it in the FAQ section of the mutual action plan. Or, oh, you asked me to have a conversation with your head of operations. Here are the notes from that conversation for everyone involved to see. Makes it really, really easy for Ross, who is busy when he's sitting on the, I don't know what your metro system is in Toronto, but I assume you have one. When you're sitting on the metro, you're logging in, you're looking, you've got 3.5 minutes and you're totally up to speed on everything. When I can do that, it's a game changer.
Yeah, totally. And I think to your point about like spot checking the deal and the balance between doing the work and homework, I think is, how do you make sure it's something that an executive VP director can do in that 3.5 minutes? Is it a piece of collateral you need before the team meeting? It's not, can you fill out this whole thing? Is it, if it's another meeting, you need to coordinate that meeting for them. Hey, you need to get on with this ops person. If it's not a check-in thumbs up type thing that you're sending them all the details for and forwardable, you need to schedule that meeting. You need to jump on with that head of operations. And I see a lot of people be like, they didn't do this, or it's moving slow. It's been 3 weeks since this key meeting and I'm still waiting on this. It's like, you're waiting on it. They're waiting on you to do the thing for them.
Yes.
Because they're interested. They reached out, or they're having these conversations with you. They want this to move forward. You ask them to do something that is more than the average person, and meeting them at the right level, right? If this isn't the champion that is just like, hey, I need to get this thing done, and it's an executive or even manager level, they're not going to have more than that 3.5 minutes on the subway or on, in their morning or between meetings. So I think that's super important.
And that's really
about.
smart. No, what you said is really smart, because I haven't done that, where it's like, you said you need to connect with Ryan. Like, I'll take it on myself to send the email to you and Ryan being like, hey, Ross and I just met. He shared that he needs to sync with Ryan on A, B, and C. Like, feel free to put me on B, C, C, but like, now it's on your to-do list of your inbox. And like, I've already given the context on everything, and I save you that work. And so what's cool about this is it makes the deal move so much faster. And again, like, we use the word transparent here a lot. And like, we talk a lot about in sales, like getting the buyer to be honest with us. And what's cool here is like, if for some reason the deal is in a place where it's no longer a deal, or it's getting pushed, or like something's going to throw it awry, the buyer's going to let you know, because they're going to feel really bad, because they're like, man, this Nick guy is like, he's going above and beyond. He's like trying to help schedule stuff. Like, what happens is the person says, okay, this person is actually trying. And I don't believe that there are, like, sometimes I get on webinars like this and I hear people beat their chests about, oh, salespeople are lazy, they don't do the work. Like, I think 99% of salespeople do. The problem is, I don't think they give enough visibility to the buyer about all of the work that they're doing. And so I know you're sitting there biting your nails, like waiting for Ross and Ryan to like have their connect call. Like, take that anxious energy and just send the email to intro. And now you're going to get insight into, like, if Ryan's like, what the heck? What is this, Ross? I don't even have context. Okay. You're going to know like something's going on there. But yeah, when you put the work on yourself and you demonstrate and give visibility to the fact that you're working for the customer, you get so much more out of them from a transparency perspective.
Totally. Well, I know we're wrapping up here in a second. I'm glad that we ended up on that, because I think that example can be transferred to pretty much every single part of the deal, from that initial email intro to that post first call, any stakeholders who need to be involved, anyone that needs to be updated. You're doing your weekly pipeline reviews with your managers, or even daily.
Yeah.
Hey, this is what we have next. I'm sure you're busy sending this thing. No one's ever going to be like, if they're a qualified potential buyer, either for now or later, going to be like, Nick, stop telling me what I need to be doing on this thing, because they're trying to get the thing done or evaluated or something, and you're doing the work for them, you're keeping it top of mind. I think people are afraid. My biggest takeaway from this section actually is that vulnerability, is that it's not the laziness thing, is that it's a vulnerability thing. And how do you help your team or yourself be in a position where you can put yourself out there and feel confident about that, whether that's checking in with your colleague, being like, hey, go check on this email, or this is what I'm doing this call, having someone that maybe if you're doing things for the first time, or you're asking your team to do things for the first time, like be there to support them from doing these uncomfortable things, because I don't know, I'm a weirdo, wasn't uncomfortable for me to do for the first times. But I keep seeing this and I'm like, why are people doing this more? They want to win these deals.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I'll leave that with is like, when you send, like, I'm thinking again about like the bullet point emails of like, here's the things that you told me were important to you, and the hesitancy around like vulnerability for people to put that in there. And I think it's because, like, Ross, when you think about the goals that you have for Accord, you don't have it, I bet, in this like super formal businessy language. You have like a very like human idea in your mind of like what you want to accomplish. And if I'm a seller and I send over like the human language of like, here's what I heard from you, well, it's important that I sense check there, because that's how I'm selling to you. Like when you're selling, you're constantly reorienting the way you explain your solution around what's important to the customer. And if you don't have that right, you're dead in the water. You're dead in the water. So yeah, like worst case scenario, the customer's like, you're totally wrong about these things. And then they correct you. Well, that's the best discovery you could possibly have done. Now you know the truth.
Yeah,
now you know the truth.
But people are afraid of getting that no. And that's why I think that's why it comes down to, I think, the vulnerability to be said no to get to a no as soon as possible. If I'm not getting to a no on that first or second call, I'm kicking myself 3 weeks later being like, wow, I just wasted the team's time on these pipeline updates, all of this stuff, all my time jumping on or tracking them down and spending my mental space on this. If I listened appropriately and I played that back to them and they said the right thing, I would have known immediately. Yes.
Yeah. 100%.
Cool, man. Well, thank you everyone for joining live / this recording. Nick, I got some good takeaways from my team to start implementing in myself, especially around those pre-call notes. I think we need to get better at that. But appreciate you taking the time, Nick, and everyone else. And happy selling. Hopefully you have something to take away from this session to try out tomorrow with your customers, and hit us up on LinkedIn or an email and be like, I tried this thing and it didn't work. You guys are assholes. Or no, hopefully this was great, and I appreciate the tip. So take it easy, everyone. Happy selling.
See y'all. Thanks, everybody.